Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with everybody again. I wish we could all be together in person. Hopefully next year, that's on the uh, that's on the table. But for now, this will have to do. And it's certainly been an interesting year. By way of background, just so that you know where I'm coming from, a lot of my thinking has to do, it comes out of the discussions I have working with New Street Research, an equity research shop that works with institutional investors. My job is to help them understand policy and how that implicates various capital allocation decisions. But I do keep my hand in the kind of the policy front with Brookings and with some other projects I'm working on. And in addition to the National Broadband Plan, back in 2009 and 10, I was chief of staff at the FCC during the Clinton years. If the people might notice that I've worked in both the Clinton administration and the Obama administration, so my political affiliations are not a secret, but I hopefully will keep political commentary to a minimum and just try to explain what I think is going on, what to look for this year in particular, with that kind of combination of looking at both policy and capital markets as kind of the foundation. In other words, there are lots of things that are going to go on in policy, but I'm going to focus on those things where there's a particular financial angle. And let me just say that I welcome questions at any time. We'll certainly leave time for questions at the end. But if there's anything that I'm saying that either doesn't make sense or you want to drill down longer on, don't hesitate to use the chat function to do so. I'll go to the next slide. What I thought I'd do is start off by, if I can get the next slide.
Oh, sorry.
Let me start by doing a kind of an overview of what I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to give some political context for what we can expect from 2021. Next, I'm going to talk about what to expect from a Democratic FCC. And I might note that literally minutes ago, the president, in a way that was totally predictable, as many of his appointments have been, named long-serving Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel to be the interim chair. She is certainly under consideration to be permanent, and I think we'll talk about her and how she's looked at things. And we'll look at a couple of other things that the FCC will be looking at, including the most recent auction for subsidies for rural deployment, as well as some spectrum issues coming up. Next, we'll talk about tech regulation. Certainly, if you're looking kind of from a perspective of the next 10 years, the regulation of the technology sector is going to be a long-running battle, and I think one that's going to be important to people, both as citizens, but also kind of the finance community. A highly underrated thing, which is I think the courts, so I'll explain why I think it's underrated. And then finally M&A, because I know that always drives a lot of thinking and in terms of the financial community. Next slide. So 2020 was pretty unpredictable, as it turned out. If a year ago we had been talking about how the year would go, I would say pretty much everything we would have said would have been wrong. But interestingly, that's not really true in policy. I would have said the two most important things are the resolution of the T-Mobile Sprint court case, which was had just completed in New York. And the second thing would have been how the FCC decides to do the C-band auction. And that auction is also wrapping up. There really wasn't that much more that happened because election years are usually fairly dead in terms of policies. People are wrapping things up, but they're kind of legacy types of things. They don't start new things. And in the same way that yesterday's inauguration represented in lots of ways turning a very, very new and very different page. The first year of a new term is very, very different than the last year of an administration, even an administration that thinks it's going to be reelected. The one counterexample, by the way, was in 1996, where, and I was chief of staff at the FCC at the time, we had to implement the 96 Act. it was made a lot easier by the fact that most people believe Clinton was going to win. But that's a counterexample. The first year of the new term is where new and big ideas happen. They don't happen late unless they're in a response to a crisis. And I would say that we're likely to see that with Biden. I think Biden so far has been pretty predictable. The issues that he set out in the campaign are the same issues that he's been talking about in terms of governing. There's everything that's most important kind of fits into four buckets. COVID, dealing with the vaccine and getting that out, economic recovery, social justice, and climate change. He's been very, very consistent on that. But I would note that there are some issues, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about some of the FCC priorities, that fit into a couple of different buckets. Infrastructure, for example, you could say is primarily an economic recovery issue, but it's also a social justice issue. I think we'll see that in a variety of ways. The other thing that he's been fairly predictable on is personnel picks. Pretty much everybody served in the Obama Biden administration. There's not a lot of new faces. That's not surprising. You know, Biden is, and the people around him have been around him for a very long time. I would say that something that hasn't been commented on is the people who will see him the most have a very significant technology background. First of all, there's Ron Klain as chief of staff. Ron was Al Gore's chief of staff when we worked together on the 96 Act. He then did a number of things, including being general counsel to Steve Case's venture firm. And so through that, Ron knows a lot about the technology industry, certainly more than any presidential chief of staff that we've had to date. And I would argue probably more than all of them combined. Steve Ricchetti, who is a senior advisor to the president, also has done a lot of work in the technology field, represented a number of technology companies, including AT&T. Louisa Terrell, who's one of the most important people because she's in charge of the legislative affairs shop, worked at the FCC, worked at Facebook, worked on Capitol Hill for Biden, actually worked at Biden's foundation, but as someone who kind of knows the range of technology issues. And I think that's important because you're at the highest level, they will be both interested in how the framework for dealing with these issues. Now, the predictability, I think, is about the change. I would say that interest in certain broadband issues is growing, and the anger at tech from multiple sides is also growing. So when you put those two things together, you get a kind of combustible mix. I would note that already there has been a really interesting executive order that came out yesterday on racial justice that says basically he wants all the government departments to look at how they assure that people have equal and fair access to all the services of that department. There's a long history here, but I would just note that when you're talking about education, healthcare, workforce development, among three things, it's pretty hard to see how you would argue people have equal access if you have 25% of the country without broadband in their homes. And so that's the kind of issue that's going to grow out of that initiative. I think either later today or tomorrow, there's going to be another executive order calling on the FCC to do certain things that are kind of COVID related that the Trump FCC chose not to do, such as using E-rate funding to get more kids online, things like that. But the combustibility of what's going on in tech, we'll talk more about that when we get to tech, in combination with what COVID taught the country about the importance of bridging digital divides, I think is going to lead to some new and creative ideas and hopefully some new solutions as well. Can I get the next slide? So let's talk about what to expect from a Democratic FCC. The first thing that one can expect is they will, I should say, so Jessica is going to be interim chair. The current FCC is 2-2. My guess is probably sometime end of March, maybe April, there will be either a new chair and a new commissioner, or Jessica will be named as chair, and then there'll be a new commissioner. But in either event, there will have to be a Senate proceeding to give the Democrats a majority. They cannot move forward on the so-called Title I and Title II. I assume most people here know what that is, but just to remind people, the idea of net neutrality, which was originally mentioned in an essay by Professor Tim Wu in 2002, is that ISPs ought to treat traffic in a non-discriminatory fashion with 3 very specific rules: no blocking, no throttling, and no paid prioritization. The FCC has gone back and forth as to how to implement those principles, which most people agree with. There were several efforts to do it under so-called Title I, in which the carriers are treated as information service providers. The court said you can't do it under that provision. Finally, in 2015, Tom Wheeler and the Obama FCC said, okay, we're going to reclassify as Title II. That was upheld by the courts. And then Ajit Pai and the Trump FCC said, no, it's actually Title I. The courts upheld that as well, giving deference to the FCC. When the Democrats get a majority, one of the first things they'll do is either start the proceeding or end the proceeding to reclassify it as Title II. Unless Congress intervenes, we can chat about that. They'll name it as Title II. It'll go back to the courts. That'll, I think, be the 5th time the courts will have seen it. I actually don't think it matters that much because those 3 principles are the companies have already agreed to. But there are hints that if you have Title II, you might do price regulation and unbundling. I don't think there's a serious threat of that. Other people think there is, but that's what that debate is about. And you'll certainly, it's a debate that, like a lot of debates in Washington, has a lot more heat on it than light. But it's certainly one thing to expect from a Democratic FCC. Second, and I think far more important one, is universal broadband. One of the things that we wrote, or probably, I mean, the structure of the National Broadband Plan was fundamentally, we need networks everywhere, we need everybody on, and we need to utilize the networks better to deliver essential services like healthcare, education, workforce development. What happened when COVID hit was suddenly lots of people started writing, oh my God, we need networks everywhere, we need everybody on, and we need to use them better to deliver essential services like education, healthcare, and workforce development. Part of me thinks, why weren't these people saying that 10 years ago when we really needed them to help push that agenda? But the truth was 10 years ago, it wasn't as obvious. But now it's pretty obvious to Republicans and Democrats. Part of the problem is the funding base is weaker than ever. The contribution factor, and I think I'm speaking to an audience that knows more about the contribution factor than most audiences I speak to, is now at about 32%. It's doubled in the last 4 years. One of Chairman Pai's great accomplishments from a political perspective is he got people to ignore that because it was actually very, very problematic. He is leaving his predecessors with a very big problem. And yet the FCC is not at all prepared. They have not done their homework relative to how they would create a more stable funding base. So that's part of the challenge. I think there'll be efforts to change that in Congress. Industry is kind of uniting around an idea that Congress should pay for a lot of it, if not all of it. So I think that's an important thing. I think Democrats will be more concerned about cybersecurity, privacy, and other consumer concerns. Tom Wheeler, at the end of his term, started to do some things. Ajit Pai reversed them pretty quickly. He was criticized by Jessica in particular. So I think Jessica will start to bring those things back. And then finally, let me just mention kind of a wild card, but an important one, is that Biden's already said we've got we've got this big COVID package. We're going to also offer, when he speaks to a joint session of Congress sometime in February, I think it'll be after the impeachment. I think they're waiting to figure out how long that'll take. But whenever he speaks about it, he'll have a plan for an infrastructure bill. He proposed one in the campaign that calls for $20 billion for rural broadband. That can affect that whole contribution issue. I actually think there'll be more than $20 billion in that infrastructure proposal. But we'll see. There may be other funds as well. I note that there's a question about our Facebook and Twitter carrier platform and AWS. I'm going to delay answering that question to the section on tech regulation. But Bill, thank you for sending it. And if I don't answer it when we're talking about section 230, please ping me and I'll make sure that we do it. It is partly related. I'll say very quickly that if the carriers cannot get Congress to fund the needs for universal service, the carriers would like the FCC to somehow tax Google, Facebook, digital advertising, maybe AWS, maybe Netflix. They don't really care, just so long as you're taxing somebody else. The problem is the FCC doesn't have legal authority to do that. I think, and I'm kind of alone in this, that there is a possibility, not a likelihood, that there actually could be a modest broadband package that does universal service, Title I and Title II, and a few other things. This would not be the extensive package that the 96 Act had. But there's actually, I think, politically a middle of the Congress in both the Senate and the House that's pretty close on a number of these issues, and you could possibly tie these things together. And one of the things we'll talk about later is how the courts are going to play a bigger role in regulation. Because of that, I think there's a level of uncertainty that makes people more willing to negotiate. But we can talk more about the details of that if there's an interest. So let's go to the next slide. Also on the FCC, I think one of the biggest issues facing the new FCC, and I might note there was a letter from about 115 members of Congress 2 days ago on this very issue, very unusual and large bipartisan coalition that basically, I think people in this room know that the FCC in December finished up the so-called Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction, committing $9.2 billion to connect 5.2 million locations. I may be off on my 100 millions, but it was a little bit less than 2,000 per. There were some things where, the reverse auction mechanism worked well to reduce the cost of the subsidy. And if people don't know what that's like, I'm happy to answer the question, but I'm going to assume you do. But there were a lot of things that didn't work. One of them was the fact that the maps don't really work. The FCC has very bad maps. Everybody knows that. And so what people found was that the FCC was actually funding some very wealthy areas and some areas that weren't really rural, but because of the way the mapping works, made it look like there were no providers, even though there was. But the bigger problem is that they've committed $9.2 billion to a number of folks who it's very unclear whether they will be able to honor those commitments. The first thing I would note is that a promise made is not a promise kept. And you've already seen in certain auctions like the CAF2 auction, where people commit to doing something. They use some of the money, they meet early promises, but then they don't start the they stop keeping the commitments, the FCC will then say to them, wait a minute, we're going to take your money away. And they say, well, you could do that, but um, we'll sue you. We'll keep you in court for years. And by the time you actually, even if you get it back from us, you'll be years behind. We're just a little slow because turned out labor force issues or whatever, or another COVID or whatever. And the FCC probably says, okay, but we're serious and we're going to fine you because, you're not keeping your commitments. And then they say, well, any dollar that you fine us is a dollar we have to drop from our capital budget, and that'll just slow down how we're going to build out. Oh, by the way, we were just about to build out to this little community, which happens to house the state legislator who's happens to be head of the Public Utilities Commission committee in the legislature, and he's going to be really upset when we don't build out to his house. So you might be getting a call from him. Anyway, you see my point. The leverage moves away from the FCC as time goes on. So what 115 members of Congress did was to say to the FCC, if you're not totally comfortable that these people are going to keep all of their commitments, you should not give them you shouldn't give them the money. And in the so-called long form application, which is what happens next, you should essentially say they don't meet the standards of review and we're just going to have to auction it again. So that's the RDOF situation. I would note there are some others like Starlink, which is Elon Musk company, got $1 billion or 890 million to do what they would have done anyway. But they got the money. I suspect they will actually keep their commitments. And there are some others like Charter Communications and electric co-ops who will keep their commitments. But there are a few folks who you just go, are they really, they've never done this in the past. How are they going to do it now? So next slide. And then of course, one of the most significant things the FCC does is allocate spectrum. And DC is very hung up on 5G, and that's perfectly fine. I think there are going to be some significant things. We are finishing up the largest auction in terms of money in the history of FCC auctions, and that's now a 25-year history. The wireless companies have committed $80 billion, actually 93 all in, to buy a bunch of spectrum in the so-called C-band. There's a lot of details about it, but the biggest thing I would say is simply from a Wall Street perspective, there's a lot of uncertainty about how the companies will actually pay for it. In other words, will they be able, if they're going to spend 80 billion on spectrum for 5G, how are they going to get that back if they can't charge more money for a 5G service than for a 4G service? A couple of other issues coming up at 12 gigahertz, which kind of pits billionaires versus billionaires. Elon Musk wants the FCC to be pretty strict about allocating it. Michael Dell and Dish, so it's Charlie Ergen, want the FCC to open it up to new uses. That's a fun one to watch. 2.5 gigahertz is a spectrum band that T-Mobile has a lot of, but wants to complete their national footprint. Another one where lots of different folks are shooting for different, kind of trying to get a competitive foothold in different ways. But you'll see if you follow spectrum stuff, that'll be important. But I would say that one of the things I think is important from a market perspective, it's not really about 5G, it's really about which spectrum-based business models best serve the applications to come. 5G gets all the press, but there's a new generation of Wi-Fi coming that's also going to be gigabit capable. And the question is, are there mobile uses? 5G is going to be better than Wi-Fi in terms of security, in terms of privacy, and in terms of mobility, and maybe some other things. But it ain't that much better in terms of performance. And if you have basically a free gigabit nomadic service, To me, the real question is, will there be um, uh, the kind of mobile uses that mean people are really going to want to buy a more expensive 5G service as opposed to depending on their cable operator who can give them that kind of nomadic experience. I don't think people are going to be watching 8K television on big screens while they're driving their cars. By the way, I do think the single biggest use of this advanced services will be online real-time sports gaming. That is something that industry does not like to talk about. You've never heard them. They talk about remote surgery and autonomous vehicles. I actually don't think those are very significant use cases for various reasons, but online real-time gaming will be one of the biggest social problems we have in the year 2030. It'll also be one of the biggest industries, because if you can bet a dime on whether the next play is a pass or a run on every single play, that is a really big business. Finally, let me just note that there's kind of a little bit of a wild card, which is the Pentagon controls the next big swatch of mid-band spectrum that's really good for 5G. A lot of question marks about what the Pentagon wants to do with it. I won't go into details, but this is something where lots of people are worried that the Pentagon wants to build their own network and then allow private sector folks to use it, but that could create new competition and also drive prices down. And part of that is concern about Dish, which is, of course, trying to enter the market and is probably the most disruptive force, our potential force in that marketplace. If you believe Dish is going to succeed, you probably want to be shorting the other. The market doesn't, so you probably want to be shorting the others. If you don't believe they're going to succeed, then you're probably consistent with where the market is. Next slide. Tech regulation. So a lot is going on near the end of the Trump era. Both the Department of Justice and the FTC, and in addition, most of the states filed antitrust lawsuits against Google and Facebook. Those will take 5 to 7 years to resolve. I don't believe the companies are ever going to want to settle them. So that will be hanging over the companies for some time to come, but is fairly important. Second, Congress. And now we're kind of getting to a question that was asked earlier. I think Congress is going to act on Section 230. Section 230 is the now famous section of the Communications Decency Act that essentially immunizes so-called platforms from liability for content on their platform. So when Twitter started correcting Donald Trump in the spring, Trump started saying we should eliminate Section 230 liability. And Biden himself has said we should get rid of 230. What 230 really does as a practical matter is it allows the companies to essentially get rid of any threatened litigation before they enter discovery. They can simply say we're not liable because of Section 230. The problem is that Section 230, the legislation was written because what was happening in the early days of the internet where people were starting to moderate content because there was a lot of really bad content. There was all kinds of sexual stuff that's you might think of as illegal or should be illegal. There were various other kinds of criminal activity, and the platforms wanted to moderate the content in part, because it was illegal, but also because they wanted people to have a platform that represented kind of the shopping mall that they wanted to be on. The idea shopping mall that, you want to go to a place that's more family friendly or whatever. The courts were basically saying, if you do any moderation whatsoever, you're responsible for anything that's said. And so that put them in a difficult bind. Section 230 passed, and lots of big companies grew up. but Congress is now rethinking that. Um, One of the interesting things that happened after the insurrection of January 6th was, of course, Trump got deplatformed by Twitter, but also the conservatives' favorite platform, Parler, lost access to AWS. And so there's a lot of questions where kind of antitrust and Section 230 tend to blend in the public debate. But as we sit here today, Facebook and Twitter are not carriers. They don't pay into universal service. There are no serious proposals for them to do so. But there will be a lot of debate about who should really take on the responsibility for example, paying for enabling everyone to get on the internet, and that will intersect with Section 230. So that's a debate that's coming up. Privacy, that we've been debating that for a long time. The Republicans have not wanted to allow, their big thing is liability for violations of privacy. When are you actually liable? What kind of notifications you have to do? With the Democrats in charge of both houses, my guess is they could pass the bill in the House and get that bill on the floor. And so there's a much greater chance in the Senate, I should have said, much greater chance that something actually happens. And finally, let me note that in October, there was a 500-page report from the antitrust subcommittee recommending a number of changes that are really focused on the technology community, that are trying to adjust antitrust law and doctrine for a world where data is kind of the big moat. And I expect there's a bipartisan sense that the tech guys should be regulated more. There's not yet a bipartisan consensus about how to do that. Both the FTC and the DOJ are looking at these issues. The FTC had a big information request. It'll be interesting to see what the new FTC does with the information they gather. The DOJ really just does mergers and acquisitions. We'll talk about that more later. But the FTC is going to see whether there are any kinds of consumer harms that are being created by the way that the big companies use data. As to the states, there's activism. California has not only adopted their own net neutrality law, they've also adopted their own privacy rule. They may adopt their own rules about data portability and some other things. So the courts may block them. We'll talk about that more when we talk about the courts. But there's increasing activism against the tech community in the states. And of course, Brussels is actually ahead of the US. That is to say, the EU has already drafted both competition legislation as well as what you might think of as consumer protection legislation. And that's going to drive a lot of policy discussions, particularly if the US can't figure out how to get a consensus and move forward that way. And then the big wild card here is the China policy. And what I mean by that is, whereas in the world of kind of the web, these dominant players are scary to a lot of people, China is more scary. And when you think about the industries of the future, AI, robotics, things like drones, which could be seen as a subcategory of robotics, the companies that are leading the way and doing the research and development are the big tech companies. So there's a very kind of challenging question for the administration about, what do they do, whereas they want to have a policy where America leads the world with, next generation technologies. They don't want to damage the companies that are doing that. On the other hand, those companies are pretty powerful, and they want to make sure that that doesn't get out of hand. Next slide. So I think there hasn't been enough attention paid in policy circles to what's going to happen in the courts in the next couple of years. As a preliminary matter, I would say that, the Republicans were very successful in filling a lot of court vacancies in the Court of Appeals level and district court level, and most famously at the Supreme Court, where they now have a majority for a very long time to come. I don't believe Democratic efforts to increase the size of the courts are going to succeed, at least not in the near term. And the Roberts Court has been already very, very pro-business. I think I saw some study that said there were 83 cases in the Roberts Supreme Court over the last 5 years in which big business had a stake. And of those, big business won 83 of them. So that's a margin that I would guess would only increase if such a thing is possible with the addition of Justice Coney Barrett. And you can see where the court might do a number of things. In their mind, it'll be a much more about environmental regulation or workplace regulation, but it will certainly affect telecom regulation. The first thing and this is for telecom only, is, as I just said, states and local governments are doing various things like having their own net neutrality regulation. There will be a case which challenges that on the basis of the Interstate Commerce Clause. We've had the Interstate Commerce Clause since the Constitution, but remember back in the 1790s, most commerce was intrastate. And of course, it began with the railroads. Interstate became more and more important. And obviously in the manufacturing boom of the late 1890s, and when we get to cars and airplanes, interstate becomes much more important. But there's always been kind of a nebulous boundary between what's really interstate and intrastate. And if you look at a bag of potato chips, you'll notice there's a seal there for the Department of Agriculture of the state of Pennsylvania. I don't know why Pennsylvania gets to do that. I really don't. I should look it up someday. But my point is, that's for some reason, even though potato chips are sold across state lines, not too many potato farms in Maryland where I live, but nonetheless, it's been murky. But I can easily see this court saying, well, state and local governments have no jurisdiction over anything that touches the internet. That's a huge part of the economy. So that would limit the regulatory power there. There are a couple of doctrines that a majority of the current Supreme Court has questioned. One is the so-called Chevron doctrine, which says courts have to give deference to expert agencies when interpreting the statute that they run. And if the court were to get rid of that doctrine, that would limit federal agency power. The more important one is the so-called delegation doctrine. And what Justice Gorsuch seems to be saying is, we will not uphold federal agency power unless the delegation by Congress was very clear and specific. I might note that the FCC, since used a term that's been in federal law since the 1890s, which is the public interest, but that is not very specific. So if Gorsuch wins in that argument, a lot of the things that the FCC has justified doing would no longer be allowed. And then the third step would be to limit congressional power, even to delegate. Justice Kavanaugh, in a prior decision, or I should say in a dissent in which he wanted one of the net neutrality cases to be handled by the whole DC Circuit, said he thought that net neutrality regulation and a Title II classification was unconstitutional because the bits that travel over the internet actually belong to the ISP, and therefore the FCC having any rules violates the First Amendment, which would mean that the speech that I'm giving you today is actually not my speech, it's actually Verizon's speech. And if I were to say anything negative about Verizon, they would have a right to censor me. Obviously, I'm skeptical that that's a correct interpretation, but he's on the court and I'm not, and he will have friends on the court and I won't. And there's also an argument that net neutrality represents a takings. So I don't know what's going to happen. I just think that particularly investors, but perhaps folks in this audience as well, will want to make sure that they follow the courts as well as following the regulatory bodies, because that's going to determine a lot of who has the authority in the years to come. Next slide. I think I missed one. Wasn't there? I think you. Yes, mergers and acquisition. This is my final slide. So if you have questions, you can start thinking about those. Mergers and acquisitions very important. The new Attorney General, Merrick Garland, who I'm confident will be confirmed, is neither Robert Bork, the conservative former Yale law professor. I actually took antitrust law from him. Probably the most single embarrassing moment in my law school career was when I asked him a question. He was a lot smarter than I was. Very dangerous thing to do in law school. Is to ask people like Bork questions. But he famously said, and the court has largely adopted this, that the only measure of consumer harm, that the only purpose of antitrust is protect consumers, and that's basically pricing. There's a new movement in antitrust, Professor Wu of Columbia, who's argued that the purpose of antitrust is represented in the writings of Justice Brandeis, is it's also political power and other kinds of power. Garland is very much of a traditionalist guy. He's probably, I wouldn't say he's closer to either one. He's kind of right down the middle. He has written several articles. He used to teach it, but he is, shall we say, skeptical of some of the things that Bork would favor, such as the efficiency defense, but he certainly would not go to where Professor Wu would be. The general political environment favors tougher antitrust enforcement. I would not want to be the first big deal to go into the DOJ. There will be a lot of pressure to say no for political reasons. On the other hand, there have been a number of decisions, including the Time Warner, the AT&T Time Warner Entertainment decision and the T-Mobile Sprint decision, both of which were challenged by government antitrust officials. And in both cases, the court said, you really don't have grounds to challenge this deal. This will make people of the DOJ and the FTC more nervous about attempting to block a deal. The bottom line is analysis is always very deal specific, but there's a lot of pressure on early deals. And again, as I said, there is a growing political consensus that over the last 40 years, we've been too easy on antitrust, and industries across the board are more concentrated than is good for the American public. I think with that, go to the final slide, which is just simply to say, I'm happy to answer any questions about these or any topics in the kind of telecom tech regulatory landscape that might be of interest to you.
Thank you so much, Blair. It looks like Bill Kleinbecker, has he gotten his question answered?
I hope I answered it. I answered it later, and I hope I remembered it accurately. But Bill, if you're out there, oh, you got it. Okay, good. What other questions? Any other questions? Someone is asking, on China, Hong Kong, Taiwan delisting China's telecom, can you give your thoughts on what action the Biden administration might take that were not acted on in the Obama administration? It's a great question. I think there's a lot of internal debate in the Biden camp about that. The first thing I would say is that what Trump did on China in a funny way represented what really was starting to become a bipartisan consensus that the United States needed to be more aggressive enforcing trade obligations, enforcing other things with China. That the Clinton view, which really kind of ran from Clinton through Bush into Obama, that if we let China into the World Trade Organization and we work with them, they will become a liberal democracy. It became clear maybe it became clear to other people earlier, but it certainly became clear to some in the Obama administration that actually wasn't going to happen. Part of the reason why Obama negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership was to attack China in exactly this way. And the reason I mention that is that what Trump did was he killed that partnership. He said it was a horrible trade deal. And then he went after China. I think Biden wants to go after China as well. The difference will be, and a lot of it has to do with telecom. Huawei is a big thing here. 5G is a big thing here. There's a lot of stuff on intellectual property that's a big thing here. But there's going to be a very big difference kind of tactically how you do it. Trump had a view, America first. We're just going to tell everybody they have to do what we want on China. Reasonable minds can differ about this. This is not my area of expertise. But for one of the big examples is on Huawei, and someone just asked about the Huawei ban. Trump said to England and Germany and France, just do it because we said so. And whereas I think England has kind of come around to that point of view, Australia was already there. Germany is not there. And there are a lot of other countries, particularly in Africa and Latin America, where we don't really have allies. I think Biden is going to try to reestablish the allies. It is more, I don't know that he's going to bring back the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but he's going to try to create an alliance of the EU, of other Asian countries, so to create a better enforcement mechanism. And you can see him, by the way, doing the same thing with the Iran nuclear deal. As to the Huawei ban, I think that continues. I think there's a bipartisan consensus that Huawei is effectively a state actor and therefore represents a security risk. And I think that not only will we continue that ban, but the government is going to pay some small telecom operators who have Huawei equipment, because that was the cheapest, to replace it with either Ericsson or Nokia equipment. Two other quick points. Number one, apparently from sources of mine, but I think it was also in the press, Trump was amazed to learn that America did not have any manufacturing equipment providers. So there was a big internal debate in the Trump administration about how do we have an American first policy when we're actually simply supporting a couple of Scandinavian companies. I think what a consensus started to emerge really from the companies, in a way it was started with Facebook, for this so-called ORAN, which is an open radio access. I apologize for our dog barking. We've all had these situations in the last 10 months. The government is funding it. A lot of companies are signing on online. And the idea here is you really build kind of these open interfaces for the radio access networks where you can piece together different parts, but with a real emphasis on software where America has greater strength. So that's there. And then there's a question, do you see the Biden administration promoting connecting environmental policy, work from home and broadband policy? Yeah, I actually do. And I think it comes in a variety of different ways. I don't know that they're going to adopt policies on work from home beyond for the federal workforce, but that's a pretty big workforce. But I certainly think that one of the big impacts of COVID is, I think the percentage of people going to the same office 5 days a week is really going to go down even when COVID is gone. But more importantly, I think that when you look at the broadband package, the infrastructure package that Biden's going to put out in February, I would think there would be a number of things related to what we might call smart cities. And a lot of those go to cleaner energy, more carbon efficient ways of gathering information and doing various things. So as I mentioned, Biden has these 4 priorities. vaccine, economic recovery, social justice, and climate change, broadband really does fit into all of those four things. And that's actually both a great thing for broadband policy, but it's also a complicated thing for broadband policy because it's not quite clear who owns that policy.